I'm Lars Mathiasen, and I've been the academic director for the practitioner scholar program at Georgia State University since its inception in 2009. And I will add to Adrian's presentation by looking at these issues from the point of view of literature. And in particular, if you're an author that wants to write one of these types of papers, an empirical translation or an essay paper for the EMR, how should you think about and utilize literature in writing a good paper? So it's about the role of literature. And I gave you two references here, and the first is actually an essay I wrote, which is about this issue that you can find in EMR, and the other is an empirical paper that I also contributed to with Luke Grabowski that I will use as illustrative example. So besides what I say here, you can look at these two sources and there will be expanded knowledge about my presentation in those two sources. So if you think about literature and then engage scholarship, broadly speaking, or more precisely writing a translation paper or an empirical paper, where does the literature come in your thinking about the paper and your writing of the paper? And I suggest to you that it comes in three different places. The first place is in what the paper is about. So you can say the area of concern. There is a focus in the paper and it addresses a particular area of concern, and I'll come back to examples of that, of course. But here the literature is basically those parts of what you find in readings that you try to contribute to. You can say it's the other authors that have written about the same things as you're trying to write about, and you must relate what you're writing about this area of concern to what the other authors have written about this area of concern. And in the example in the paper of Grabowski and myself, the area of concern is strategic change in small organizations. The second place where literature comes into your thinking about and writing of a paper is in the analytical framing of the paper. And that is the literature that supports your analysis of data or your reflection over experience. So it's a framing device. And it can overlap with what we just talked about, but it can also be different. We will see that. In the actual example here, it's quite different. It's a theory, namely actor network theory, that is used in this paper to analyze data in a small organization that struggled with strategic change. And then finally, the literature again comes into play as you argue for contributions in your paper. And you can say that in the end of these papers, you must draw on your empirical findings or your experiences and on extant literature to articulate and argue for some contributions to knowledge that can be both practical and theoretical. And you can say the two forms of literature that relate to the area of concern and relate to the way you frame your analysis of experience or data will then come back here and play together with your empirical findings or your experiences to articulate these contributions. And you can see how they come together in the paper, as the paper's contribution is networking during strategic change in small organizations. So actually you can see here how the area of concern is strategic change in small organizations. The framing device that is adopted is a particular form of networking theory, and then they are brought together in a contribution as how to understand the role of networking in managing strategic change in small organizations. So I'll now walk through each of these three and go into a little more detail on each of them as a help to how you proceed in writing a paper for EMR. So let's first focus on the area of concern. That is, as I said, the literature that your paper contributes to. Now, very importantly, there's a test of what this literature is. You cannot sort of freely choose it, because all engaged scholarship starts out from a practical problem context. So this is practitioner research, and therefore there will be at the start or foundation of what you do, there will be a particular situation, a particular context, a problematic situation to which you want to apply evidence-based research to inform those practices. And you must therefore choose your area of concern. That is, you must position what you try to do in relation to the literature in a way that is grounded in that experience or those data. You cannot choose freely. So that's the first boundary condition for what the literature about A must be. Secondly, this particular literature you must provide a comprehensive review of. This does not mean that you're writing, 500 pages about it, not even 10 pages, but it means that you must provide to the reader of the paper an understanding of this literature that makes the reader say, okay, I understand, that's what this literature is, that's how it's presented in the literature, and now you can go on and position your particular contribution in relation to that literature. So for example, a good idea is to create a small summary table of the key authors maybe that have contributed to this literature, or the different streams of literature, or the different research methods that have been applied to that literature, to provide some kind of overview of that literature. Very importantly, when you write the review of this literature to position your own research, there is a very particular purpose of doing that, and that is really that you want to talk about that literature in such a way that you create an opportunity for you to make a contribution to it. So it's not just writing about it and sort of writing everything that can be known about it. It is really to writing about it from your point of view, that is with the research you are communicating in your paper. How does this literature then look, and how does this open itself for you as an opportunity for you to make a contribution? And that can be done in different ways. The most typical is to identify a gap. That is, you write about what is known and what is not known, and you are then trying to contribute to what is not known. But in a more subtle way, you can also reveal critical views of basic assumptions or commonly held wisdoms in a particular literature, and say you want to question these. You want to look at it in a different way. So rather than addressing a gap, you are trying to reposition the foundation for looking into this particular area of concern. I give you an example here, which is a quote from the paper by Grabowski and me. And here we say, managing strategic change in all organizations is challenging, but it is particularly difficult in small organizations. With limited resources, small organizations not only must come together internally, but also must satisfy the diverse interests of powerful external stakeholders. So you see here, we go from the general literature on managing change, which is huge, to the particular challenges, which is a practical problem, of managing change in small organizations, and we espouse what these challenges are. It is both internally and externally, and it's a difficult balancing act to do so. And we therefore argue that our paper will contribute to this literature by addressing this gap. Then there's the analytical framing. And again, the analytical framing is the literature that supports your analysis of data or of your experiences as you try to translate things into practice. Again, let's relate this to the practical problem setting that drives your research. And it is very important here that this framing device is reflective, I use this term, reflective of your practical problem setting. Let me try to put it differently. You must be able to make sense of your practical problem setting. You must be able to analyze the data that are available, or you must be able to generate reflections about your practice using this framing as a vehicle, as an intellectual vehicle to come up with new insights or new intervention options or empirical insights. You should not give a comprehensive review of this analytical framing. That's related to the area of concern where you're going to make a contribution. Here, you need to make what I would call a selective review. So you're going to present this framing, and the focus should be on motivating why, that is, persuading your reader that this is actually a good way to think about or analyze the particular things that you're interested in your paper. So your presentation should focus on the concepts and claims that you're relying on if it's a qualitative paper, and it should focus on a conceptual model and your hypothesis if it is a quantitative paper. Again, let me move to the example here. If you recall, then in this paper by Grabowski and myself, we use actor network theory as an analytical framework, and we don't present all the concepts. It's actually a very rich and also varied set of concepts and theories really that together constitute actor network theory. We have selected 3 essential concepts that we use in our paper. The first is heterogeneous actors and networks. The second is non-human agency, and the third is translation. So these are the concepts that drive our analysis, and we explain them in the paper in the brief room that is available. And the basic claim of the theory as we apply it here is that actors are constantly building and destroying networks and negotiating and maneuvering with other networks to create ordering effects and to align interests. You can say that's a very quick summary of the basic claim of actor network theory, and we apply that to the particular realm of strategic change in small organizations, and we apply it to analyze the empirical data that are available to us. Now, if you have these 2 foundations in the literature related to your area of concern, that is what your paper is about, and your analytical framing, that is how you look at your data or analyze your experiences, then you will be able in the end of the paper to articulate your contributions, which is really why you're writing it and what the reader hopes to get out of the paper by reading your research. And again, here you draw on the empirical findings or your reflections over your experiences and on extant literature to articulate and argue for contributions to knowledge. Now, in the particular context of engaged scholarship or practitioner research, there will be an equal balance on 2 types, as Adrian talked about, as 2 types of contributions or 2 foci. One will be on practical contributions, and the other will be on theoretical contributions. So if you look at the practical contributions, they can be of various sorts. I think the empirical account itself, whether it's telling about your experiences in translating something, or it is in the analysis of your empirical data in your empirical paper, that in and of itself is an important revealing of practices that offers contribution to knowledge. But more importantly, we should also draw practical conclusions from there and from our analysis. And we saw in the paper that you can have lessons for practice. And these lessons should be drawn from the empirical insights and from the theoretical foundation of your analysis. And then in addition, you can make theoretical contributions to the literature. So let me show the examples in the paper here. There is an extensive empirical findings section in the paper by Grabowski and me. I will not belabor that here, but they conclude into 4 lessons for practice. And you can see the flavor of them here. that they actually speak to the practice of being a manager in a small organization that is engaging in strategic change and maybe is struggling with making this happen. And you can also see how they are articulated from the point of view of actor network theory. So the first is to avoid premature internal convergence toward one strategic solution. Keep an open mindset. The second is engage external stakeholders early to explore alternative options. Open your doors and open your brains for the world outside the small organization. The third is take iterative steps towards a desired and feasible strategic solution. That is, don't worry about rejecting what you thought earlier was smart and be open to new ideas. And the final one is recognize and leverage influential non-human actors, which is, frankly, the essential claim of actor network theory, that artifacts have similar power as humans inscribe their interests into these artifacts. So here you see in the paper the articulation of a practical contribution that is grounded in the empirical analysis and drawn also on basic concepts from the theory. And here you see then an attempt in our paper to bring together our analysis and the theory into a theoretical framework for understanding and explanation of how strategic change might manifest and unfold in small organizations. I'll not go into the details of the model, you can see it in the paper, but it summarizes our theoretical findings in the paper.